In 1987, a 34-year-old man named Raymond Hale returned to his grandparents' old cabin deep in the Teller County woods after his grandmother's funeral. He came to clean up and sell the land. But hidden inside his grandmother's old rolling pin, he found a small key, one that unlocked a cellar door he was never allowed to enter as a child. Inside, behind a false wall, Ray discovered his grandfather's journal, a forest map marked Deer Creek, 3 nests, photos of enormous footprints, and a single handwritten note. They'll come for the last promise. That's when he learned. For over 40 years, his grandparents had secretly protected a hidden species in the forest. Locals called them the moss folk, beings who wove moss into nests and left bundles of wild licorice as gifts. Ray began following the old trail. He found massive footprints, small handprints side by side in the mud, and strange laughter like children's voices echoing through the trees. But he also found new survey stakes, signs that developers were moving in to build a private lodge. One night, a young moss folk appeared just 20 feet away and raised its hand in peace. Ray didn't move. He simply nodded and lifted his hand back. Trust, as fragile as thread, had just begun to grow. But when a wildfire broke out near the survey site, Ray faced an impossible choice: save the legal files that could protect the forest, or save a young moss folk caught in the flames. He chose life, and the documents were lost. Weeks later, as the snow melted, that same young being returned and placed something beside Ray, a second green-veined stone, and a century-old boundary marker buried long ago by Ray's grandmother. It was the final proof. The promise made had been kept. And now, Ray brings his granddaughter Tess to the same forest, not to tell her everything, but to let her feel that the forest is a safe place, just like it once was for him. Far in the trees, something tall watches her, then silently retreats. And for the first time, there is no sound, just a warm, heavy silence. Not all treasures are gold, Ray whispers. Some walk on 2 legs through shadow, and they need us to protect them too. Where are you watching from? How far can this story reach? And how many people still believe that magic might be real? If you felt something watching this, consider liking this video and subscribing. Together, we're building a community that believes in the unseen, that protects wonder, and welcomes every soul who still dreams of Bigfoot. With all our warmth, thank you for being here. The key was still there, tucked in the hollow wooden handle of Grandma's old rolling pin. Just like she used to say, some things stay where they belong. Ray Hale stood in the silence of the cabin's dim kitchen, fingers wrapped around the cool brass, the weight of the key heavier than he remembered. Or maybe it was the grief, dense and sour, pooling behind his ribs like late summer thunderclouds. The funeral had ended 2 days ago. The casseroles had stopped coming, and Teller County was beginning to blush gold at the edges. Outside, the Colorado air was brittle with the first bite of fall. But inside the old pinewood walls, it still smelled like cinnamon oil, mildew, and something older. History clung to every beam. The cabin hadn't changed much in 30 years. Same warped floorboards that creaked in apology. Same foggy window panes held in by crooked wooden grids. And the same painting of Deer Creek slung over the fireplace, now bowed with dust and time. Ray hadn't planned to come back, but Grandma had left him the deed, and with it, 1,000 untold questions. The cellar door was at the back of the pantry, hidden behind a stack of tomato jars and a frayed gingham curtain. It hadn't been opened in decades, not since his grandfather died. Ray remembered being 6, asking why that door never opened. Grandma would just pat his head and say, "Because that's a door for old promises, Ray, and old promises are sacred." But now she was gone, and the promises, whatever they were his to keep or break. The key slid into the lock with a sound like dried leaves being crushed. The latch gave easily, too easily. A breath of cool, musty air spilled up from the dark, thick with earth and rust and apples. He grabbed the old kerosene lantern from its hook, lit it with a match that hissed like a whisper, and descended. The stairs groaned under his weight. The air grew colder. Down here, time had congealed. Dust like flour clung to old shelves. Bottles of apple wine, some frosted with age, lined a rack to his right. Labels handwritten in his grandfather's slanted script. The lantern's flame danced across a wall that didn't quite sit flush like the others. Ray moved closer, knocked it once. Hollow. He ran his hands along the edge and felt the seam. A false wall, then another layer inside, a double. He pried carefully. Something behind shifted with a thump. Inside, a shallow crawl space, no bigger than a closet. And in it, a cardboard box wrapped in wax cloth, yellowed and stiff. His throat tightened as he pulled it out and laid it on the floor. The first thing he found was a small notebook, faded leather cover, elastic band long since gone slack. His grandfather's handwriting filled its pages, looping and precise, dated across seasons from the mid-1950s into '58. There were maps inside, hand-sketched with red ink notations. One of them was labeled Deer Creek, 3 nests. Ray's breath caught. Under that, a Polaroid of what looked like a bare footprint in mud, too large to be human, too detailed to be fake. And then, a cassette tape, labeled in black ink, 2:04 a.m., AUG 12. His thumb brushed over it, a sudden chill crawling his spine. In the corner of the cellar sat the old mail bin his grandma used for junk and forgotten bills. He dug through the pile of yellowed envelopes until he found a crisp, white document sealed in modern plastic. A land valuation notice. A development firm, something with Pine Ridge in the name, was interested in acquiring surrounding plots. And they'd included his. The offer wasn't high, but it wasn't low either. And stapled to the back, a preliminary zoning map with a proposed resort lodge skirting the property line. He turned back to the diary. Toward the end, his grandfather's handwriting changed. More angular, ink smudged in places, as if something in him had begun to tremble. The last page read only, "They'll come for the last promise." Ray stared at the sentence, his breath shallow, lantern flickering against the cellar walls. It wasn't clear who they were, but whoever they were, it felt less like a warning and more like a prophecy. Later that afternoon, Ray stood outside on the porch, wind teasing through the thinning aspens, phone pressed to his ear. The reception out here was shaky, but he got through. "Harlan," he said when the voice on the other end answered. "Yeah, it's Ray Hale. I need to ask you something about the boundary lines up by Deer Creek." There was a pause. "You opening up the old place, Ray?" "Yeah," Ray said. "And I think someone else is trying to claim part of it." The ranger's voice went quiet. Then, calm, but clipped. "You found the maps, didn't you?" Ray hesitated. "You knew." "I know more than I ever wanted to," Harlan replied. "You bring those maps in. I'll show you what they're missing." The call ended. The silence that returned wasn't peaceful. It was full, charged. Ray looked back toward the tree line, where the sun was beginning to drop behind the ridges. The sky had turned gold, but the woods looked darker than they should, as if something waited there, watching or remembering. That night, Ray sat at the old kitchen table, cassette player turning slowly beside him. He pressed play. At first, just the faint rustle of wind, a creak, like wood shifting under weight, then a breath, and then soft, rhythmic knocking. 3, 1, 3, 1. Ray's skin crawled. The sound had no explanation. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't random. It was a pattern. The tape hissed again, and then, at 2:04 a.m., a sound he couldn't mistake. A deep exhale. Close. Wet with breath. Then nothing. He let the tape run to the end. No voice. No conclusion. Just that code-like rhythm and something breathing in the dark. Ray stood slowly, walked to the back door, and opened it. The forest looked quiet, but it wasn't. Somewhere in the wind, something knew the cellar door had finally opened. And someone or something was listening. A single dry leaf fell at his feet. He didn't move, because deep down, Ray already understood. The past was awake now. And old promises, they never stay buried. Not here, not in these woods. Not when the knocking starts again. Ray left early. The sky above Teller County was still soft with blue haze, the kind that follows a night without wind, when the trees seem to listen. His boots hit the dirt like clock hands ticking forward, slow, steady, hesitant. He carried the map folded in thirds, corners worn, red ink lines pulling his eyes back to the place he hadn't set foot since he was a kid. Deer Creek. His grandfather had circled it in ink that had bled just slightly into the paper grain. 3 nests, it said in the margin. No other explanation, no dates. Just that. And yesterday's cassette tape still haunted his ears with its pattern. 3131. A kind of knock you didn't forget once you heard it. It wasn't just sound, it was rhythm with intent. The trail was overgrown, but the bones of it were still there under the scrub and dying grass. The air was sharper out here, thinned by the season change, and the trees had started shedding their edges like paper curling in flame. Ray pushed through a copse of young pines, their needles brushing his jacket sleeves like cold fingertips. And then the ground leveled out. A clearing, just like the map had shown. He stopped. The first thing he saw wasn't a nest. It was mud, dark, damp, recent, and pressed into it, as if whoever had walked through had no care for who saw, was a single footprint. Large, 5 distinct toe marks, a heel that went deeper than his fist. The print had ridges, folds, texture, not just a print, a presence. He crouched down. The edge of the print was still moist. Not hours old, maybe less. And then, just to the side of it, barely touching the edge, was something else. Smaller, too small to be human. A handprint, palm flat, fingers splayed, each no longer than a quarter's diameter. It wasn't just the size that struck him. It was the position. The smaller print was placed with care, almost reverence, as if it had been mimicking the larger one, or reaching toward it. Ray swallowed hard. Something moved in the corner of his eye. He turned, but it was just the trees shifting with wind. At the far end of the clearing stood a wooden stake, fresh and clean, unlike the moss-covered debris that littered the rest of the forest. It had been hammered deep into the earth, red paint dripping from the top like dried blood. On it sat a stone, not just any stone, but smooth, wet-looking, as if pulled from the heart of a spring. Blue-green veins ran through it like frozen lightning. Ray approached it slowly, boots silent in the softened ground. He reached out and picked it up. It was warm, then a click, a shudder. He spun around. A boy stood 10 feet away, camera in hand, chest heaving. 16, maybe 17, tall and lanky, a mop of brown hair barely tamed by a backwards cap. His flannel shirt was too big, sleeves rolled, eyes wide. "You don't want to do that," Ray said, voice low. The kid blinked. "I wasn't. I just saw you out here and thought, you from town?" "Sort of." The boy lowered the camera. "Wyatt Dorn. I live up off County Road 46. You're Hale, right?" Ray said nothing. "I've seen you before. You used to come out here with your grandpa. He let me fish the creek once." The name clicked. Ray remembered now. A scrawny neighborhood kid who never stopped asking questions. Wyatt. Always trailing behind with his 2 big boots and too bright curiosity. "You can't be taking photos," Ray said. Wyatt shifted. "I wasn't going to post it or anything. People been talking. Something's been moving around out here." Ray's face stayed still, but something in his chest thudded. Wyatt looked past him. "Is that a footprint?" Ray stepped forward, slow but firm. "Go home, Wyatt." "But..." Now. Something in Ray's tone made the boy back up, nod once, and turn. His boots broke twigs all the way down the slope. Ray watched until he disappeared. Then the wind shifted. It wasn't the gust of wind that raised the hair on his arms. It was the sound that came with it. High-pitched, giddy, not a word, but laughter. Childlike, but stretched. The kind of laugh that didn't belong here. It came from the thicket upriver, where the land rose into a rocky edge just above the creek. Ray turned toward the sound, eyes scanning, body motionless. But it was gone, like it had never been. Only the birds answered now. The creek gurgled below. He stood there a long time, long enough that the sun moved a hand's width across the sky, and the heat gave way to that familiar fall edge. When light fades too early and the shadows start to look like figures waiting for dusk. He made it back to the edge of the property just as Ruthie Calder was unloading a bag of feed from her truck. She looked older than he remembered, 62 and wiry, hair silver and braided back, hands worn like old river stones. She nodded once, as if she'd known he'd show up eventually. "You been out there?" she asked. Ray nodded. She didn't ask what he saw. She didn't need to. "Someone's been staking new markers along the back trails," she said, wiping her hands. "Near the old hide trail your granddad used to use, the one nobody talks about." "Red tops?" "Yep." Ray frowned. "Private developers." Ruthie shrugged. "I don't trust their boots, and I sure as hell don't trust their intentions. But that's not all." She leaned closer. "Couple nights back I heard something. Same as I did back in '89, when my boy got lost in the woods. Same laughter, same feeling in my gut that something was watching. Not cruel, just curious, like it wanted to be seen, but didn't know how." Ray stayed quiet. Every cell of him tuned in. "They're still out there," she said, voice softer now. "Maybe not all the time, maybe not the same ones, but something's walking through our woods, and it's leaving marks again." She looked him dead in the eye. "I think they know you're back." Ray didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch, moonlight carving silver lines across the porch rails, the map open on the table in front of him. His fingers traced the circle marked 3 nests. Only one was confirmed. The others were still phantom places, hovering in lines and memory. He remembered something his grandfather once said when they were camping by Deer Creek, back when Ray was too young to understand it. Some things build nests the way people build churches, not just for shelter, for meaning. Now Ray wasn't sure if his grandfather had been speaking in metaphor. The laughter echoed again in his head. The tiny handprint, the red stake, the warm stone. He folded the map back, stood, and looked out into the trees. They swayed slightly, though there was no wind. In the silence, he almost expected to hear it again, the knocking. But it didn't come. Not tonight, but he knew it would, because this time the story wasn't hiding. It was waiting, and it had already begun to laugh. Deer Creek looked different in late October. The gold was gone. The copper, too. Now the hills were muted in washed-out grays and browns, a carpet of curled leaves crunching like old paper under Ray's boots. The wind had lost its gentleness. It bit now, dry and restless, tugging at the collar of his jacket as he moved deeper into the ridgeline above the creek. The map in his back pocket was worn thin at the folds, but he didn't need it anymore. The path had started to memorize itself into his muscle. He'd marked the first nest days ago, a crude structure tucked along a shallow slope, hidden behind a spill of hawthorn and fern. That one had been intact, undisturbed, quiet. But the second had been circled twice on the map, as if someone had thought it more important, or more fragile. Ray found it just before noon. It wasn't buried or disguised. It sat in a natural basin, shaped by time and storm runoff, where the light pooled through bare branches like diluted gold. At first glance, it looked like part of the forest. Limbs woven together, spruce boughs and strands of lichen bent and braided over an arched frame. It was wide enough for a person to crawl inside, if they dared. But it wasn't the size or shape that made Ray stop cold. It was the construction. These weren't branches thrown together by wind or animal. They had been bent with precision, twisted, split, then tucked in like hands had done it. Not claws, not hooves, hands, one by one. Ray dropped to one knee and stared. There were small pieces of moss stuffed into the crevices. Squirrel fur. A string of vines that had been tied into loops, like a pattern, almost decorative. The earth around it had been patted down, but not trampled, as if whatever lived here had learned to tread with care. He moved around the edge of the dome, fingers brushing the arch. It held. Even with the wind leaning through the trees, the structure didn't sway. A silence hung over it. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of waiting. Like it expected someone to return, but they wouldn't, because the nest had been torn open along one side. The branches splintered. Moss ripped away in chunks. A pile of walnut shells lay scattered on the dirt beside it, cracked and half-eaten. Ray picked one up. The shell was split clean through, but not gnawed. The edges were flattened, ground down by something wide and even. Not teeth-shaped for hunting or tearing. Something else. Something dull. Human-like. He looked up suddenly. Across the water, near the bend of the creek, a shadow moved. Slow. Tall, not rushing, just drifting along the trees. Ray held his breath. The figure never looked his way. Just walked. One long stride at a time, until the trees swallowed it again. It had been large, no question. Shoulders too broad for a man. Gait too fluid for a bear. But there was no fear in it. No aggression. Just presence. The wind shifted again. A smell drifted by. Pine, wet bark, and something like cedar smoke. Ray stood slowly, heart hammering with a rhythm he didn't want to admit felt familiar. The way some old songs settle under your ribs before you remember the lyrics. He didn't chase. He didn't call out. He just turned and made his way back up the ridge. Later that afternoon, back at the cabin, Harlan Pruitt stood hunched over the hood of Ray's truck, tracing a finger along the old boundary map spread across the dusty surface. The ranger's hands were cracked, nails rimmed in dirt, but steady. He smelled of wind and worn leather, and his jacket bore the scars of too many seasons in the field. "These lines haven't held up in decades," he muttered, eyes narrowing. "See this creek fork? That shifted in the flood of '91. Everything south of it technically should have been resurveyed." Ray crossed his arms, gaze tight. "So they could claim the boundaries off?" "They could try," Harlan said. "And with enough lawyers and a sweet pitch about tourism jobs, someone at the county office might just let it slide. But they're building too close. The markers I saw, they're deep in." Harlan didn't look surprised. He slid another paper forward. A proposal draft printed on glossy cardstock. Pine Ridge Private Lodge. Conceptual renderings. Trail access. Riverfront cabins. Minimal disruption, it claimed. "Minimal disruption," Ray echoed, mouth dry. "They ever ask what they'd be disrupting?" Harlan snorted. "They think these woods are just empty land. Old growth, some deer, maybe a bear or two. Nothing worth keeping." Ray's fingers curled into the edge of the truck. "They don't see what we do," Harlan said. "Because they're not looking." A gust of wind tugged at the map. Ray held it down, but his mind was already back at the nest. At the shells. The broken dome. "If they built near Nest 2, he said, almost to himself, "then where's Nest 3? Harlan looked up sharply. "There's a third." Ray didn't answer. But the map had left it open. Just a small triangle drawn in the northwest corner. No notes. No label. Just a question mark drawn in his grandfather's hand. And a dot. Out beyond the ridge. Beyond the logging trail that hadn't been cleared in 20 years. That night, Ray couldn't sleep. The fire burned low in the hearth. But it wasn't the cold that kept him awake. It was the image of the nest. The care it took. The handprint in the mud. The laughter that still rang, faint and strange, behind the silence. He pulled the cassette player out again. Let the tape roll. The same breath, the same rhythm. 3, 1, 3, 1! He didn't know what it meant yet. But it wasn't random. Not a pattern made by chance. It was a signal. A language. A memory trying to surface. He leaned back in the chair, eyes on the ceiling. Something had been broken out there. And something else had seen him notice. Just before dawn, the first knock came. Not on the door, not on the walls, but on the porch railing. 3. Pause. 1. Pause. 3 again. Ray sat up slowly. The fourth knock never came. Instead, the wind rose, curling through the pines like a whisper with teeth. A twig snapped beyond the glass. Ray didn't move. Not yet. Not until the sky turned pink and the shadows retreated back into the trees. Because some answers didn't come in words. They came in patterns. And some warnings didn't shout. They knocked, then waited, then watched to see if you listened. And now, he was listening. The wind had changed, not just direction, but weight. It blew drier now, colder at the edges, like it had been sharpened on stone. Ray noticed it first in the morning light, how the way it moved through the pines sounded more like whispering than rustling. Leaves no longer danced, they skittered. The last warmth of fall had lifted overnight, replaced by that early snap that made the earth contract and the skin on your knuckles start to split if you didn't watch for it. He stood on the porch that morning with a bundle of twine in one hand, 3 honey drops wrapped in wax paper in the other. It wasn't instinct that guided his hands. It wasn't tradition. It was something quieter. A pull, a suggestion he didn't quite understand but couldn't ignore. Like something had been left unfinished between them. Between him and whatever intelligence had woven that mossy dome by hand. He'd spent the night after the knocking thinking about what people considered communication. Some used words, some used symbols, some used silence so dense it made your bones ache. He figured whatever these beings were, they didn't need language the way people did. They noticed patterns, intent. They watched what you left behind. So he left something. On the edge of the back trail, not on the main path, not by the porch, but tucked into the elbow curve of the cabin's shadow. He set it down. 3 honey drops in a triangle, the twine curled into a circle, and 1 sprig of sweetgrass, dried and tied with red thread. Then he stepped back. Not far, just enough to give space. By noon it was gone, but something else had appeared in its place. A small, almost humble bundle, knotted together with thin grass cord. Inside, 3 pieces of wild licorice root, still soft, still fragrant. He hadn't mentioned licorice to anyone. Not once, but his grandmother used to leave it in the hearth for luck when storms came. They hadn't just taken his offering. They'd answered. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply bent down, held the roots for a moment in both hands like he was holding a secret, and took them inside. That night, the knocking came again, this time from the side wall near the chimney. 3. Pause. 1. Then silence. But Ray didn't move to the window. He didn't light the porch lamp. He just stood still, eyes closed, breathing with it, letting the rhythm reach him. The next morning, as the frost bit through the grass tips and sunlight filtered pale through the pines, a voice called from the tree line. "Hello?" Ray turned. A woman, early 30s, stood with a clipboard hugged to her chest and a scarf pulled tight against her neck. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her boots were real hiking boots, not the kind worn for Instagram. "Sorry to barge in," she said. "You must be Ray Hale?" He gave a nod, wary but open. "Maribel Cortez," she said, extending a hand. "I work with the Front Range Conservation Trust. We've been following the zoning proposals in Teller County." Ray raised an eyebrow. "I saw the red markers by Deer Creek," she said quickly. "And I know the lodge proposal's already been submitted, but your land's still in negotiation phase. If you're willing, there's a conservation easement path that could protect this acreage permanently. No buildings, no subdivisions, Ray studied her. You think they'd let that slide? If the easement is recorded before final zoning approval, they'd have no grounds. This place would be legally protected. It's a race against paper, Mr. Hale. He nodded once, slow. Maribel's eyes softened. I know this land has history. I'm not here to take anything. I just want to help keep it from disappearing. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. And she seemed to understand that was enough for now. That night it happened again. He was stacking firewood under the back eave when he saw it. Movement, small, not more than 4 feet tall, stepping lightly between the trees like it had done it 1,000 times. It didn't dart or flee. It didn't hide. It simply stopped in the moonlight, just where the trees opened enough for its outline to be seen, and it raised a hand, open palm. 5 fingers, held steady, gentle. Ray didn't move. It didn't either. Time suspended itself for a beat, maybe 2. Then the figure lowered its arm and slipped back into the darkness. The stillness that followed didn't feel like absence. It felt like permission. Later that same night, his phone buzzed against the counter. 1 bar of service, maybe 2. Ruthie. He picked up. There's a truck, she said. Parked just off the fire road. Been there 2 nights in a row. Markings? None I can see. But the plates are out of state. Colorado doesn't park like that. Ray was already grabbing his flashlight. You think they're watching the cabin? She asked. I think they're watching the woods, he said. He didn't sleep. The cabin felt thinner that night, like the walls weren't quite holding in the warmth or the quiet. By morning, frost had sealed the porch in a sheet of brittle white. His boots crunched down the front steps. He didn't go far, just to the trail bend again. He left nothing this time, but the day after, there it was. Another offering, not wild licorice, but a braid of dried thistle and cattail, bound together in a loop. And in the center, small, precise, was a pressed feather. Not crow, not owl. Something deep brown and unfamiliar, like it had come from something in between. He brought it in. He didn't need to know what it meant. Not yet. Only that it meant they were still there, still listening, still answering. And someone else was closing in, from farther away, but getting closer. The first snow didn't fall. It arrived quietly, like a memory returning uninvited. Ray woke before sunrise to the sound of stillness pressing against the cabin, a kind of hush he hadn't heard since he was a boy. He cracked the door open and stood for a long moment on the threshold, the cold biting into his bare ankles. The world had gone white overnight. Pine branches stooped low with soft weight. The dirt road erased beneath a blanket of powder. Even the wind held its breath, as if afraid to disturb whatever had settled here in the dark. The snow made everything clearer. Tracks would show. Sounds would travel farther. But it also made things more vulnerable, more permanent. You couldn't pretend not to see what was right in front of you. He spent the morning in the back room. The rickety chest in the corner had been his grandfather's. No lock, no label. It smelled like cedar and dried tobacco and something faintly metallic. He hadn't opened it since the funeral. He wasn't even sure why he opened it now. Maybe it was the snow. Maybe it was the sense that something underneath all this was starting to stir. Something that didn't care if you were ready or not. The hinges creaked. Inside, beneath a folded quilt and a stack of yellowing flannels, lay a bundle of oilskin tied with twine. Ray pulled it out carefully and laid it across the table. The fabric resisted at first, stiff from age, but gave way with a slow tear. Inside, papers, letters, a folded map with burn marks along the edge. A photograph, his grandfather, squinting against the sun, hand on the shoulder of a creature too tall to be fully visible in frame. Only the side of the torso showed, broad, furred, scarred, and tucked beneath it all, a journal. The same handwriting he'd seen in the cellar. The entry was dated November 19th, 1958. He came stumbling just past dusk, bleeding bad from the side, gunshot. Not sure how far he ran. Looked like he was carrying something at first, but dropped it when he saw me. Not threatening, just collapsed. We hid him in the root cellar. Marjorie stitched what she could, took turns watching through the night. He didn't sleep, just breathed like it hurt and watched the ceiling. Next morning, the smaller one came to the edge of the tree line. Didn't come closer, just waited. Left something there, berries, stacked, careful, almost like a thank you. Ray stopped reading. He closed the book slowly, hands trembling in the silence. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't story. This was written, dated, witnessed. His grandparents had helped one of them, hidden him, protected him, and the others had known. He opened the chest again and found a sealed envelope wedged in the side. It was addressed to nobody, just a handwritten label, Covenant. Inside, on weathered stationery, was a page written in ink now faded to brown. It wasn't legal jargon. It was simple, honest. No photos, no pointing, no bragging, no trail left behind. If you help them, you do it without proof. You do it without pride. You do it because it's right. Both his grandparents had signed it. There was no question now. Whatever was happening here hadn't started with him. It had started generations ago, quietly, with care, and with risk. And now that silence was starting to crack. He heard the knock around noon. Not from outside, from the mailbox. He stepped into the snow. The flag was down, but inside, among the junk leaflets and a gas bill, was a manila envelope. No return address. Inside was a formal offer, typed, crisp, legal. A development firm out of Boulder had assessed the land. They wanted to buy. The number wasn't insulting, but it wasn't generous either. Just enough to tempt someone tired of fighting. The final page held a clause circled in red. Should the offer be declined, developer reserves the right to challenge historical boundary lines via county litigation. Ray read it 3 times. They weren't asking. They were warning. By afternoon, the sky had dimmed. Snow drifted sideways in light sheets as he made his way into town. The coffee shop was quiet. Just a few locals huddled near the fire. Wyatt was there at the far end, phone in hand, face pale. When he saw Ray, he stood too fast, nearly knocking over his chair. "I didn't mean to," he said before Ray even reached him. "Mean to what?" Ray asked. Wyatt fumbled with his phone. "I just told one guy. Just a friend. He posted something on a forum. Now it's getting shared. People are asking questions." Ray's stomach went cold. "What did you tell him?" "Just that something was out there. I didn't say what. I didn't post photos. I swear." Ray didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at the boy, eyes flat and calm. "You don't get to play with this," he said. "This isn't a story you get to tell if you don't understand what you're saying." Wyatt looked down, shame rising behind his flushed cheeks. "I'm sorry." But sorry didn't take it back. The rumor was out now, spreading, growing teeth. Ray stepped outside, boots crunching through the fresh fall. Ruthie met him by the post office. She'd been waiting. "They knew," she said without preamble. Ray looked at her. "The Moss folk," she added. "They knew you were different, that your family was. That's why they trusted you." Ray didn't answer. He was tired of guessing what they knew. Tired of knowing it always cost something. "You remember when my boy got lost in '93? She asked. "Yeah." "You know who brought him back?" Ray's eyes narrowed. He was 4, too small to find his way out. But he was warm when they found him. No scratches. He said a tall lady with hair like trees walked him to the trailhead. Said she made him promise not to cry. Ray didn't speak. "They've been helping longer than you know," Ruthie said. "And we've been helping back, quietly, because that's the only way it works." He stared at the snow, a question forming in the back of his mind. One he didn't ask. Not yet, but Ruthie answered it anyway. "There's more of us than you think. The old families. The ones who still remember what it means to stay quiet." The snow fell harder that night. Ray sat by the window, the fireplace crackling low. He held the feather bundle in his lap, the one with the cattail braid and the pressed center. It was fragile, already curling at the edges. But it hadn't fallen apart. Not yet. Neither had the promise. And neither would he, even if it meant paying a price. The dry wind came first. Not the cold one from the north, but the restless, thirsty kind that scrapes through pine needles and finds weakness in everything it touches. It moved across Teller County like it had someplace to be, picking up dust, stripping bark, curling dead leaves into brittle spirals. By late afternoon, the cabin windows rattled in their frames, and the air had the kind of stillness that made you check twice for smoke, even when there wasn't any. Ray had felt it all day. It was in the way the birds went quiet, the way the squirrels abandoned the trail behind the woodpile, the way the forest no longer watched him, but seemed to brace for something bigger than him. He'd grown used to signs, knocks on the cabin siding, shapes in the tree line, bundles left at dawn. But today wasn't about communication. It was about warning. And even if no one had said a word, the message was clear. Something was coming. He was cutting rope on the back porch when Harlan's truck pulled up fast, tires spitting gravel. The ranger didn't bother with a wave. He jumped down, eyes sharp, jaw tight. Fire. Ray stood still. Started from the ridge. Looks like someone dumped ash from a barrel. Still hot. Wind took it. Ray dropped the rope. How far? Too close. By the time they reached the rise above Deer Creek, the sky was no longer blue. It was smudged with rust and brown, the kind of color that makes you squint before you even smell the burn. Below them, smoke licked its way through the trees, thin at first, then thicker, clawing up toward the slope like it had fingers. The wind was doing most of the work now, spreading embers fast through dry branches and brittle pine cones that snapped like bones under pressure. Harlan cursed under his breath. There's a clearing near the southern edge. Old campsite. If it jumps there, the lodge boundary line is cooked. Ray stared down, heart thudding against ribs that didn't want to move. He knew what else was near that site. Not just land, not just markers. Nest 3. The one still unconfirmed. The one that had stayed silent all this time. The air changed again. Somewhere between gust and smoke, a sound cut through. Not a bird, not a branch. A cry, small, high-pitched, buried in wind. It wasn't human. Ray didn't wait. He ran down the slope, boots sliding in loose rock, smoke stinging his eyes. Harlan shouted after him, but Ray was already gone, weaving through low brush, eyes scanning the orange-hazed treetops. The heat came in waves now, pockets of dry warmth that pulsed from root to canopy. And then he saw it. Near a ring of half-burned fern, slumped against a moss-covered stump, was a small figure, furred, curled in on itself, limbs drawn tight like a child in pain. Its chest rose and fell in fast, shallow breaths. Smoke danced around its back. Its head jerked weakly when he stepped closer. The young one, no taller than his hip, dark fur matted with soot, its eyes barely open, but not afraid, just exhausted. Ray knelt fast. The heat pressed against his neck like a brand. Flames were no more than 20 yards out, crackling through low-hanging needles. His heart kicked into overdrive. Then it hit him. Back up the ridge, tucked beneath a half-fallen pine, was the bag. The one with the boundary documents, old maps, and the only remaining copy of the original survey lines. If he left it, he lost every legal claim he had to fight the development. No paper trail, no proof, just a burned-out hillside and a corporate hand ready to move in. But the kid in front of him, this small, struggling thing, it wouldn't last 5 more minutes. The wind screamed through the trees. Ray looked between the smoke and the stump, and he made his choice. He scooped the creature gently into his arms. It didn't resist. Its hand, soft, impossibly human, latched weakly onto his jacket as if it understood what was happening, as if it had known this moment would come. Ray turned and ran. The smoke swallowed him almost immediately. His lungs screamed. The world blurred, shades of orange and black, burning pine and cracked branches. Twice he stumbled. Once he fell, knees jarring hard against stone. But he didn't let go. The young one pressed its face into his chest, not from fear, but from instinct. Then, a shout, a flashlight beam cutting through haze. Harlan. They burst through the tree line together, stumbling into open ground just beyond the slope. Snow from the night before still clung to the grass here, and it hissed under the weight of ash and ember. Ray fell to his knees. The creature wheezed, eyes half shut. "Jesus," Harlan said, pulling his coat off, wrapping it around them both. They didn't speak for several minutes. Only when the sound of crackling wood began to retreat behind the fire break did Ray let go of the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked down. The small one had gone still, but not lifeless, just resting, like it had given everything to reach this point and trusted the rest to someone else. They waited until the fire crews arrived, but Ray already knew the documents were gone. Burned. Paper always was the first thing to go. He had no proof. No property line defense. No legal shield left to stop the developers. Only what he had carried out in his arms. And then, as they stood on the edge of the burn, smoke curling off the bark of trees still standing, something stepped from the tree line behind them. Not loud, not slow, just present. A figure larger than either of them. Broad, tall, covered in singed fur and soaked in the smell of earth and forest. It didn't approach. It didn't threaten. It reached out. A hand, massive, calloused, thick with knuckle, rested gently on Ray's shoulder. Not heavy, just there, warm. A full second, then another, then gone. Back into the smoke, back into the trees. Ray didn't turn. He just closed his eyes and nodded once. Because some debts aren't paid in paper, and some acknowledgments don't need words, but they last just the same. Winter didn't leave Teller County in one sweep. It retreated slow, like someone slipping quietly from a room, not wanting to wake the sleeping. The snow thinned but stayed in patches, stubborn where the pine shadows held tight. And the creek, it began to hum again. Not loudly, just enough. That low, glassy note when the ice starts cracking beneath its own weight. Not breaking, not yet. Just warning. Ray stood above Deer Creek before sunrise. The frost on his boots was fresh. Below him, water moved beneath the hard shell of ice, thin sheets separating like old skin. Steam rose from it where sun met melt. He could hear it, soft, insistent, alive. That song the creek only sang when it knew winter was almost done. He didn't bring offerings anymore. They weren't needed. What came now was unprompted. At the bend where two boulders met, just before the channel narrowed into a small rapid, something rested at the edge of the ice. At first he thought it was a trick of light, but as he stepped closer, the shape came clear. A small figure, crouched low, fur matted from snowmelt. Back hunched. It didn't flinch when he approached. It turned slowly, as if expecting him, as if waiting. The same young one, the one he had carried from fire, but stronger now. It didn't make a sound, just uncurled its hand. Inside, resting in the center of its palm, was a stone, smooth, oblong, the same green-blue shimmer as before, veined like river glass. But now it was polished, shaped, purposeful, and beside it, half wrapped in a dull scrap of worn cloth, was something else. Metal, not clean, not new. Old brass or bronze, dull with time and soil. It caught the sunlight like a relic from underground. The young one set them both down on the ice, stepped back, watched. Ray knelt, bare fingers brushing the cloth away. A survey marker, the kind used before the county standardized tags. Pre-1950, the engraved letters were shallow but intact. A corner of stamped code, numbers that wouldn't mean anything to most, but to someone checking land claims, they meant everything. This was proof, not just of the land's history, but of its boundaries. And more than that, proof someone else had held this before, buried it, marked something, meant something. Ray looked up. The young one was gone. Not frightened, not fast, just gone. The way they always did, like fog folding into itself. He tucked both items into his coat, stood, The wind passed low, no bite left in it. Back at the cabin, he didn't sit. He dug. Behind the shed, where the snow had pulled back from the dirt, was a patch of ground his grandmother used to call the quiet garden. Nothing had ever grown there. Not tomatoes, not mint, not even weeds. But she'd always said it wasn't about what grew. It was about what stayed. He scraped the soil with a trowel, careful, steady. And 6 inches down, he felt metal. He cleared it with his hands. Pendant. Silver. Oval. The edges chewed by age. But in the center, faint but still there, was a pressed symbol. One Ray hadn't seen since childhood. A heart. Tiny. Notched into the shape of a leaf. His grandmother's. She used to wear it when she baked. Took it off before bed. Said it was her way of remembering who she was before she became someone's wife. He hadn't seen it in 20 years. And now it sat in his hand, buried in the garden that never grew. Not lost. Left. The message was so clear, it made his throat ache. They had known she'd made a promise, and they were reminding him to keep it. Maribel arrived that afternoon. She brought papers, a satchel of field forms, and a map folded so many times the edges looked soft as cloth. Her boots tracked mud across the porch, but she didn't notice. Her eyes went straight to the items on the table. The marker, the stone, the pendant. She sat without asking. "Where did you find them?" she asked. "Where she left them," he said. They said nothing for a while. Then she opened the folder. Inside, a printed draft. Emergency conservation application. Precedent clause for historical inheritance protection. Legacy clause from handwritten journals and privately notarized letters. There was a spot for a witness and a place to staple the marker photo. "Once this is filed," she said softly, "it's not just your word anymore. It's legal memory." Ray didn't speak. He just reached into the drawer and pulled out the old journal. His grandfather's handwriting. The entry from 1958 still folded at the edge. He slid it toward her. "That's your notarization," he said. She nodded. They filed that evening. Email first, then courier. She left just before dusk, headlights cutting through the low mist curling over the ground like breath. Ray stood on the porch long after she disappeared down the trail. The air was different now, not lighter, but older, like something deep had turned in the soil. Later that night, the knock came again. He'd almost forgotten the rhythm. 3. Pause. 1. Then again, and again. It wasn't from the walls this time. It came from the edge of the forest. He stepped outside barefoot. The frost was soft, not biting. No one waited there. No shapes, no eyes in the dark. But the sound came once more, and this time it was answered. From farther up the ridge. A second knock. Same pattern. Then a third, from deeper in the woods. And that was when Ray understood. It wasn't a message anymore. It was a farewell. Not to him, but to the fight. To the silence they'd all kept for so long. It was being lifted slowly, one careful step at a time. Not to expose, but to survive. The stone sat on the table for 2 days before he placed it back in the garden. Not as an offering, but as a marker. Not all graves are for the dead. Some are for the promises we bury until we remember to keep them. And some stay buried just long enough for spring to find them again. The snow was gone by mid-March. Not melted, not washed away, but lifted. Like a curtain pulled back to let something old return. It left behind soft earth and steam that rose from the ground in the morning like breath. The cabin creaked less now. Not because it had been repaired, but because it had begun to settle into a kind of stillness. The kind you only earn after everything's been said, even if no one heard it. Ray stood at the edge of the field behind the cabin, boots sunk in shallow mud, the kind that pulled at your heels like it wanted to remember you. The easement papers had gone through, fast, cleaner than expected. The lodge lost its legal footing before the first post ever hit the dirt. What was left now wasn't a fight, just land, protected, quiet, alive. The morning light filtered low through the trees, not sharp, but golden in that way. Early spring always is, soft but certain. The wind had changed again. It no longer pushed. It offered. He'd left the gate open that morning, not out of forgetfulness, but something else. It felt right. Like some part of the forest had earned the right to come closer, not as a guest, not as a threat, but as a neighbor. Wyatt showed up mid-morning, a sketch pad under his arm and a backpack slung loose off one shoulder. His jeans were stained with charcoal, and his eyes looked older than they should have been. He didn't knock. He just stood at the door, unsure whether to come in. Ray let him. The boy said nothing at first. He sat by the hearth, flipped open his pad, and turned it toward the firelight. The drawing wasn't detailed, but it didn't need to be. It was shapes, lines, suggestions. The outline of a nest, hand-woven. A hand raised. A child-sized figure beneath a thick tree. And in the distance, always watching, always just out of reach. Something tall, not monstrous, not mythic. Just there. I won't post them, Wyatt said. Not ever. I just needed to remember it right. Ray nodded. That's all we can do. The boy turned another page. This one showed the back porch of the cabin. An older man, a child in his lap. The child wasn't drawn exactly human, but not quite other either. It sat curled like it had done that 100 times. The old man's hand rested on its shoulder. Not holding, just present. Wyatt looked up. Do they know we mean no harm? Ray thought for a long moment, then said, I think they've always known. It was us who forgot how to mean it. That afternoon, Ruthie came by with 2 jars of pickled beans and a story that she'd been holding in her chest like a stone. She sat on the back steps, sun warming her knees, eyes tracing the treetops like she was reading scripture. You know they used to sing, she said. Not with voices, not like we think of, but it was a kind of singing. You felt it, in the trees, in your ribs. Ray sat beside her. The night my boy came back, she continued. He smelled like cedar and wet stone. Said the lady with the leaf hair told him not to cry. Told him the forest remembered its friends. I never told anybody that. You did now, Ray said gently. She nodded. It was enough. The light changed by late afternoon. Sharper. The kind that makes everything feel close to blooming. Ray went inside and found Tess curled up on the couch with a book too big for her hands. She looked up when he entered, eyes wide, hopeful in that quiet way kids are when they're waiting to be invited into something. He held out his hand. She didn't ask where they were going. She just followed. The field behind the cabin had turned soft. Patches of grass were returning, bright and stubborn. Wildflowers hadn't bloomed yet, but the ground carried the smell of something getting ready. Ray walked ahead, slow, letting Tess set her own pace. She stopped every few feet to collect things. A stick shaped like a letter, a rock with a crack down the middle, a pine cone missing all but one row of scales. She tucked them into her pockets like secrets. They reached the base of the ridge where the old path veered into the deeper woods. Ray crouched and touched the stone embedded in the soil, the green-blue one. It was still warm. It always was. Tess crouched beside him. "What's this one mean?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the last piece. A simple silver key, not to anything physical, but to memory. He handed it to her. "What's it for?" He smiled. "For when you know something but don't need to tell anybody." She turned it over in her hand like it was made of glass. Then she looked up. "Are there people in the woods?" Ray didn't nod. He didn't shake his head either. "Sometimes," he said, "but they're not people the way we think. They're something else." "Are they safe?" Ray looked at her. Then, out across the tree line. "They're kind," he said. "That matters more." Tess didn't ask anything else. She just walked ahead, a small shape moving through a world too large to carry, but somehow holding it anyway. Ray watched her stop to pick a flower. That's when he saw it. Across the ridge, almost too far to be real, a figure stood, tall, still, not in hiding, just waiting, not to be seen, to be remembered. Ray didn't wave. The figure didn't move. But in that long moment between shadow and sun, he felt something shift. Not an ending, just a change in the silence. Back at the cabin, he opened the old chest again, placed the green-blue stone inside, folded the last drawing from Wyatt and tucked it beside it, then closed the lid. Not locked, just shut. Because some things don't need to be sealed to stay sacred. That night, as the last light bent low across the floorboards, he lit a single candle and sat alone by the window. The forest breathed, the trees exhaled, and from deep in the woods, just once, the pattern echoed one last time. 3. Pause. 1. Then stillness. But not silence, because the promise had been kept, and some quiet means you're finally being trusted to hold it. Not to tell, but to live like it mattered. Sometimes, the most sacred promises are the ones never spoken out loud, the ones sealed in silence, passed down not through paper or signatures, but through the way someone plants their feet in the earth and refuses to look away. The way a door stays unlocked, not to invite attention, but to welcome trust. In the end, what matters most isn't who was right or what was proved. It's who stayed, who listened, who chose kindness when no one was watching. There are stories this world doesn't want to be told, not because they're dangerous, but because they're fragile, soft at the edges, held together by moments too quiet for headlines. But those stories are the ones that change us. They remind us that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through wind-carved trees, or echoes in the rhythm of something walking beside us, unseen, yet never unfamiliar. We like to believe the world is mapped, labeled, owned. But there are places still ruled by something older than ownership. Places where the forest decides who belongs, where the boundaries aren't drawn in ink, but in kindness, in humility, in the unshakable belief that to care for something, even in secret, is worth more than any claim you could ever file. And maybe the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't a deed or a fence line. Maybe it's the simple act of protecting something just because it's good, of not needing credit, of choosing to remember, even when others forget. Because the truth is, not everything needs to be proven to be real. Some things are only real when we believe in them gently, when we guard them without fanfare, when we let them grow in the quiet. And sometimes, if we're lucky, those things remember us too. So if something in this story found its way into your chest, if a moment made you pause, or a sentence stayed with you longer than you expected, then maybe that was the forest speaking to you, in its own way. Thank you for walking through it with us. If this story meant something to you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps these quiet stories continue to echo. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing and following the journey. Because some stories don't end. They just keep growing, quietly, beneath the trees.